All right, everyone. Today we are continuing Unit 2, Colonial America, and now we're going to focus on two of the most important early English colonies in North America, Jamestown and Plymouth. These colonies were very different from one another, but together they helped shape the future of what would eventually become the United States. One colony was built mainly for profit. The other was built largely for religion and survival. Both struggled, both nearly failed, and both became extremely important in American history. Before we begin, there are two important vocabulary terms we need to understand. The first word is charter. A charter was basically a contract or official permission from the king, allowing a company or group to establish a colony. Kings did not usually pay for colonies entirely themselves. Instead, companies or investors would often fund expeditions in hopes of making money later. The second term is representative government. Representative government is a political system where people select representatives to help make laws and decisions. This idea becomes extremely important later because the colonies slowly begin developing traditions of self-government that will eventually influence the creation of the United States government. Now let's begin with Jamestown. In 1606, King James I of England granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London to establish a colony in North America. The Virginia Company was a business venture. Investors hoped the colony would make money through gold, trade, and natural resources. The company believed the settlers might discover gold like the Spanish had farther south in the Americas. They also hoped to establish trade involving fish, fur, and other resources. So in 1607, English colonists arrived in the Chesapeake Bay area and established Jamestown, which became the first permanent English settlement in North America. Now, when many people imagine early colonies, they picture organized towns and successful farming communities. Jamestown was not like that at first. Jamestown was a disaster in the early years. Many settlers were not prepared for survival. Some were gentlemen who were more interested in finding gold than farming or building. The colony suffered from disease, starvation, contaminated drinking water, and conflict. The swampy location caused serious health problems, and many settlers died during the first years. At one point, the colony became so desperate during a period known as the starving time that settlers reportedly resorted to eating rats, leather, and in some extreme historical accounts, even cannibalism. Jamestown came dangerously close to collapsing entirely. One of the major figures connected to Jamestown was Captain John Smith. Now, John Smith was not your typical colonist. Before coming to America, Smith had already lived an incredibly dangerous and adventurous life. As a teenager, he became involved in military campaigns across Europe. He fought as a mercenary, meaning he worked as a soldier for hire. Smith traveled through places like France, the Mediterranean, and Eastern Europe, fighting in wars against the Ottoman Empire. At times, he worked alongside privateers and raiders operating around the Mediterranean Sea. While not exactly a pirate in the Hollywood sense, John Smith absolutely lived the rough life of a wandering soldier, sea fighter, and adventurer. He fought in brutal battles, survived shipwrecks, escaped slavery after reportedly being captured by the Ottomans, and built a reputation as someone who thrived in dangerous situations. By the time Smith arrived in Jamestown, he already had years of survival and combat experience that many of the colonists completely lacked. Smith quickly became one of the colony's strongest leaders. He famously pushed the rule, "He who shall not work shall not eat." Basically, if you refused to help the colony survive, you would not receive food. Smith understood that survival required discipline and cooperation. Jamestown also survived partly because of assistance from the Powhatan people, a powerful Native American confederation in the region. The Powhatans sometimes traded food with the colonists and helped them survive difficult periods. One of the most famous figures connected to Jamestown is Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan. Pocahontas often acted as a link between the colonists and the Powhatan people. Over time, she became an important symbol of communication and temporary peace between the two groups. However, the real story of Pocahontas is far more complicated than the version many people hear growing up. As tensions increased between the English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy, Pocahontas was eventually kidnapped by the English in 1613 and held for ransom. During her captivity, she was pressured to convert to Christianity and was given the Christian name Rebecca. While in English custody, she married John Rolfe. John Rolfe was another extremely important figure in Jamestown because he successfully introduced and cultivated a profitable strain of tobacco in Virginia. Some tobacco seeds had been smuggled into the colony from Spanish territories, despite Spain trying to protect its tobacco trade monopoly. Rolfe's tobacco became incredibly popular in Europe and transformed Jamestown economically. The marriage between Pocahontas and John Rolfe temporarily helped create peace between the English settlers and the Powhatan people during a period sometimes called the Peace of Pocahontas. Pocahontas later traveled to England with Rolfe and became something of a symbol for the English colony, but she became ill and died in England in 1617 before returning home. Now, despite its struggles, Jamestown eventually found a way to make money. The colony discovered that tobacco grew extremely well in Virginia, and European demand for tobacco exploded. Suddenly, Jamestown transformed from a struggling settlement into a profitable colony. Tobacco became the economic foundation of Virginia and helped ensure the survival of the colony. Now let's shift to Plymouth. Unlike Jamestown, Plymouth was founded largely for religious reasons. Back in England, some groups believed the Anglican Church, or Church of England, needed major reforms. Some people wanted to completely separate from the Church of England altogether. These groups became known as separatists. Remember, during this time, the monarch controlled the church in England, so separating from the official church could be dangerous. Many separatists faced persecution and believed they could not freely practice their religion in England. In 1620, a group of separatists received land grants connected to the Virginia Company and decided to sail to North America. These settlers became known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims traveled across the Atlantic Ocean aboard a ship called the Mayflower. The journey was difficult, crowded, and dangerous. When they finally arrived in North America in December of 1620, conditions were brutal. Cold weather, disease, hunger, and lack of shelter threatened the colony immediately. Before even going ashore, the Pilgrims created an important document called the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact was an agreement where the settlers promised to work together for the common good of the colony and obey laws created for the benefit of everyone. This became one of the earliest examples of self-government in the English colonies. Unlike Jamestown, which was originally focused heavily on profit, Plymouth emphasized community cooperation and religious unity. But survival in Plymouth was incredibly difficult, and the Pilgrims quickly realized that ideals alone would not keep them alive. The settlers used whatever means they believed necessary to survive. They built defenses, carried firearms, organized militias, and at times used the threat of violence to protect themselves and secure their position in the region. At the same time, they desperately needed help. This is where Squanto enters the story. Squanto, whose real name was Tisquantum, had lived through an unbelievable series of events before ever meeting the Pilgrims. Years earlier, Squanto had been kidnapped and taken across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe as a slave. He was eventually brought to England, where he learned English and spent years living among Europeans. At one point, he even worked with English explorers and sailors connected to voyages in North America, serving as an interpreter and guide because he understood both English and native cultures. His knowledge made him extremely valuable. Eventually, Squanto managed to return to North America, expecting to reunite with his people. Instead, he discovered a tragedy. His village had been devastated by disease, likely brought by earlier European contact, and most of his people were gone. The land where his village once stood became the location where the Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony. Imagine returning home after years of slavery, only to discover your people dead and foreign settlers living where your community once existed. Despite this, Squanto became one of the key reasons Plymouth survived. He taught the Pilgrims how to grow corn, fertilize soil using fish, hunt fish, and survive the harsh environment. Because both sides needed stability and survival, the Pilgrims and nearby native groups eventually developed agreements and alliances. After surviving devastating hardships and producing successful harvests, the colonists and Native Americans shared a feast that later became associated with the first Thanksgiving. Now, it is important to understand that the first Thanksgiving was not simply a peaceful holiday meal like the version often shown in elementary school artwork. It came after starvation, death, armed survival, diplomacy, alliances, fear, and uncertainty. The relationship between colonists and Native Americans during this period was extremely complicated. There were moments of cooperation and peace, but over time, increasing expansion, land disputes, disease, and violence would lead to growing conflict throughout colonial America. When we compare Jamestown and Plymouth, we can already begin seeing different colonial goals developing. Jamestown focused heavily on profit and economic opportunity. Plymouth focused heavily on religion, community, and self-government. Both colonies struggled to survive. Both depended heavily on Native American assistance, and both helped establish the foundation for future English colonization in North America. These early colonies were messy, dangerous, and uncertain, but they became the beginning of permanent English settlement in what would eventually become the United States.